I manage the MoneyMob Talkabout program, which is a financial education, management and counselling program working in South Australia, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. We're a team of 14, predominantly based in the APY lands, which is the Anangu, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara lands in South Australia, and half of our team are local Aboriginal people. The team will feature in my presentation a little bit later on. Before continuing any further, I'd like to thank the Aranda people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and the beautiful country in which I'm very fortunate to live and work. I pay tribute to their elders past and present. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to address you. It's really nice to have significant conferences like this held in Alice Springs, because so often these major events take place in the eastern seaboard cities, and they're quite removed from the experience and the challenges of those of us who live in this part of the world. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Central Australia and its peoples, but I hope that by the time I'm finished, I will have sparked an interest for you in having a much closer engagement with this region. Today I was asked to speak about Aboriginal financial literacy, and I will speak about this very broad topic in relation to superannuation, which is a matter of great interest and pressing concern for Aboriginal people. I'll also discuss some historical and social perspective, because I believe such perspective is critical for people of influence such as yourselves to adequately grasp if there's to be effective national progress on closing the gap of disadvantage which Aboriginal people experience, including in relation to financial literacy. One thing that non-Aboriginal people have done exceptionally well in regard to our Aboriginal compatriots is talk about them and for them. On this score, I'd hoped that one of my Anangu colleagues would be here with me today to co-present. However, due to the arrival of babies and a range of other circumstances, that has not been possible. So you'll have to make do with photos. I apologise. I also want to acknowledge that there has been some significant work already done in relation to Aboriginal people and superannuation by groups such as the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance and the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. In case you're not aware of this work, I've included references to it at the end of my presentation. I'm also aware, as Janet mentioned, that ASIC and the industry have begun work to address some of the challenges for Aboriginal people in relation to superannuation. And I was really pleased to read that a small survey found that 20 out of 27 super funds were interested in participating in industry initiatives concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their super. This is great because it will take an industry-wide approach to figure out how sustainable and workable adaptations can be made to the system so it is more inclusive and accessible for Aboriginal people. Greater inclusiveness and accessibility will in turn hopefully lead to an increase in the understanding of super by Aboriginal people. So that was supposed to be my slide number one. There's a couple of my team practicing their budgeting techniques. Turning now to financial literacy, ASIC, the government agency which has carriage of the National Financial Literacy Strategy, defines the term as a combination of financial knowledge, skills, attitudes and behaviours necessary to make sound financial decisions based on personal circumstances to improve financial well-being. Relevant circumstances might include financial inclusion, access to suitable financial products, appropriate consumer protection and financial services regulation to ensure fair and efficient financial markets. ASIC refers to 5 behavioural indicators of financial literacy identified by the ANZ Bank. These are keeping track of finances, planning ahead, choosing financial products, staying informed, and financial control, generally in relation to debt and the ability to save money. The ANZ Bank indicators closely resemble indicators of financial capability in low-income countries that were developed by the World Bank through a project sponsored by the Russian Financial Literacy Foundation. These indicators resulted from survey work in 7 different countries with a sample size of around 11,000 people. To our knowledge, there hasn't been any in-depth exploration of how applicable these indicators are to remote Aboriginal people. So this is something that we in the MoneyMob program are attempting to do through our own program evaluation. I've included a link to that work at the end of this presentation as well. Within the MoneyMob Talkabout program, we also use the term financial capability. This term also has wide usage around the world and is distinct from the term financial literacy in that it implies an ability to participate in financial activities rather than just have knowledge of them. The ability to participate in financial activities is particularly relevant to a discussion about the financial capability of Aboriginal people, especially those who live in remote communities. In both contemporary and historic terms, significant barriers to Aboriginal people's financial participation exist. I'll now talk about what these look like in more depth. As I noted previously, we're a team of 14, 10 of whom are based on the APY lands. We have 3 offices in AMATA, Mimili and ERNABELLA, which hopefully you can see clearly on the map up on the screen. The APY lands is one of the most remote regions in Australia. It's located just south of the NT border and extends across to the Western Australian border. The nearest major metropolitan centre is here in Alice Springs, a 5 to 6 hour drive away and about 500 kilometres at minimum. The APY lands is an arid and beautiful region characterised by rocky mountains, hills, dry creeks and sand dunes. For around 2,500 people who call themselves Untitled, this area is home. Most speak Pitjantjatjara language as their first language, and English is a second, if not third or fourth tongue. The people have family and cultural links into WA and the southern part of the Northern Territory. They maintained strong connection to country and cultural practices. In comparison to the total Australian population, Untitled are young. In the 2011 census, the median age was 26 compared to 37 nationally. Life expectancy of Aboriginal people is still about 10 years less than non-Aboriginal Australians. Men born in 2010 to 12 might expect to live to around 69 years old, and women to about 73. In Central Australia, it's possible that this life expectancy is even shorter. There are 6 main communities in the APY lands, usually consisting of around 400 people. These are surrounded by smaller communities and homelands or outstations, which is the picture that you can see up on the screen at the moment. Numbers in communities can fluctuate depending on factors such as the location of cultural business, funerals, or community events like the footy carnival when there may be a huge influx of people. Maintaining family and cultural links is very important to Untitled. With a population spread across 100,000 square kilometres and more, it is a very mobile population that covers enormous distances in places that are relatively poorly served for infrastructure and communications. Most houses do not have a telephone or an internet connection. Only one of the communities we work in has mobile coverage. Communication beyond the community occurs through public or workplace telephones and internet. Communities usually have a standard collection of infrastructure consisting of the community store, the clinic, the arts centre, school and community office or rural transaction centre, which also serves as the post office and the Centrelink agency. Some may also have a TAFE, a family centre and a police station. This is the orbit within which most community interaction, including financial transactions, takes place, and in which people know and understand themselves and life. Currently, it's estimated that around 50% of people in remote communities will have some sort of paid employment. School attendance rates in the APY lands are at similar levels and are amongst the lowest in the country. Completion of Year 12 is uncommon. In the Northern Territory, only 1 in 5 Aboriginal children living in isolated areas can read at the accepted minimum Australian standard, and by Year 7, just 15% achieve this benchmark, 47 percentage points behind their urban Indigenous peers and 74% less than non-Indigenous students. It would be reasonable to extrapolate that situation to the APY lands as well. Nor are the statistics relating to numeracy encouraging. By Year 9, 68% of remote Aboriginal students are failing national numeracy standards. The last I heard, about 10% of the eligible population in the APY lands had either volunteered or been placed onto income management. This is the federal government's compulsory quarantining of welfare payments through mechanisms such as the Basics card. In theory, income management prohibits the purchase of certain banned items, such as cigarettes and alcohol, from the quarantined portion of an income support payment. It's important to think about how all of these factors interrelate and to contrast it to the world that most non-Aboriginal Australians inhabit on a day-to-day basis. To grasp the implications for Aboriginal people's participation in and understanding of financial activity. Aboriginal people are generally thought to have inhabited what we know as Australia between 40 and 80,000 years. By contrast, Untitled in the APY lands have a short history of contact with Europeans, even compared with the colonial experience of other groups of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The first Europeans entered this area on an expedition around 1873. It was declared an Aboriginal reserve in 1921, and then in 1937 a mission was founded at ERNABELLA, which is also known as Pukaja, to provide a buffer between the Untitled and white doggers. The doggers were hunters paid a bounty per scalp for dingo heads. They initially paid Untitled in commodities such as flour or tea in exchange for these scalps, and were thought by some to be having negative and exploitative impacts on the local people. Prior to the 1967 referendum, which was the first time Aboriginal people were legally recognised as human beings in Australia, Untitled had a limited exposure to or relationship with money. Payment they received for work on the mission included meals, rations, medical supplies or clothing, and a small amount of cash paid as wages. Child endowment was paid to the mission to feed children and infants. Into the 1970s, some speculate that the introduction of welfare and tighter regulation of work combined to contribute to the decline in Untitled undertaking jobs. Welfare, because the nexus between labour in return for some form of payment was broken or removed, and regulation because it required more in the way of formal qualifications and contractual agreements. This departed from an established pattern of Untitled learning jobs by observation and doing. This pattern had existed strongly on the mission, along with an inherent culture of contributing to the community and sharing. Some of the implications of this. From 1873 to 1937, with the establishment of ERNABELLA mission, Untitled had increasingly consistent exposure to money and Europeans. For us, in 2014, 1937 is only 77 years ago. My mother's 76, just to give you a bit of perspective. Since this time, it's been common for Untitled to be regulated by systems which, well-meaning or not, cast them largely as passive participants in relation to finances, whether this was on the mission, increasingly from the 70s onwards as income support recipients, and in the last 2 to 3 years as income managed persons. In some parts of Australia, after Aboriginal people were eligible to receive equivalent wages to their non-Aboriginal counterparts, these were stolen or never passed on. Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australia have statutory stolen wages compensation schemes in recognition of this. Remoteness even further curtails the opportunity for many Aboriginal people to learn about and develop financial capability skills. In the APY lands, there are no banks, insurance companies, car yards, post offices, travel agents or stock markets nearby, which Anangu can regularly access to acquire and use a range of financial vocabulary, knowledge and skills. Most of these financial concepts do not have original language equivalents. They didn't exist in the Aboriginal world. They have a history which, in this part of the world, may only be between 77 and 141 years old. If you compare this to the evolution of money in other parts of the world, which is thought to date back to the 1st century BC, accounting systems beginning in the 14th century, the earliest stock market dates back to 1531 in Belgium, and we can see that the language and logic of financial systems has had hundreds, if not thousands of years to accumulate in the collective knowledge bank of non-Aboriginal people. It has been passed down from generation to generation. Despite this head start, many of us still struggle in areas of financial literacy. By way of example, the 2011 ANZ Bank survey noted that 33% of respondents found their super statement difficult or very difficult to understand. Now I've painted a broad picture of the environmental, social and historical factors which impact on Aboriginal financial literacy. I'll turn specifically to the topic of Aboriginal people and superannuation. Some of the key findings of both the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance and the Public Interest Advocacy Centre about the challenges Aboriginal people face in relation to superannuation are that there are significant gaps in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge of super and financial literacy, that Aboriginal people are more likely to miss out on accumulating super due to unemployment, intermittent, interrupted or short-term employment. For example, people who are engaged in community development employment programs for years were not eligible for super unless they worked what was called top-up hours. Remoteness from communications and correspondence and language barriers affect knowledge of and access to super. Technical language and the lack of ability to deal with someone face-to-face are alienating and exclusionary for Aboriginal people. The gap in life expectancy means that many Aboriginal people do not enjoy super to the same extent as other Australians. They're likely to reach the preservation age closer to the end of their life and possibly retire earlier due to the incidence of chronic illness, which I'm sure you would have learned about yesterday from the Purple House people. Furnishing and verification of ID is difficult for Aboriginal people, especially those living remote. Many older Aboriginal people do not have birth documents and will often say to you, "I was born in the bush." In fact, they'll say, "I was born under a bush." It's routine for Aboriginal names and birth dates to be recorded wrongly, further complicating the process of ID for the purposes of accessing super. It was found that there's insufficient support and assistance provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to locate and or make applications for the release of their superannuation. Intermediary organisations are critical to Aboriginal people being able to engage with and access super. Aboriginal kinship systems do not neatly fit into Western conceptions of family relationships, which can complicate the process for nomination of beneficiaries and distribution of death benefits. I now want to relate some client stories that I hope will bring home in very concrete terms the reality of some of the findings I've just related back to you. Story number 1 comes from Renee, a financial literacy educator and trainee financial counsellor from my team based in ERNABELLA. You can see her up on the screen. I have a client who was born in the bush north of ERNABELLA in 1930. The client speaks many different languages, but their English is limited. This client and their daughter came to me with super statements and asked me to explain what they meant. With the help of a Pitjantjatjara colleague, it was made somewhat clear to the client that this super money had accumulated over the last couple of years of the client working. Understanding this, my client decided to withdraw the money. To pay the money out, the super fund needs photo ID or a birth certificate. My client has neither, but they do have bank, Medicare and pension cards. Having spoken with the super fund staff, it is clear that providing certified copies of my client's ID plus a statutory declaration stating no other ID is available will not be accepted. The response of the super fund was to state that the client should simply get a birth certificate. So I explained to the call centre operator the kinds of problems I experience when trying to obtain a birth certificate to comply with a super fund to release funds. First of all, I, and an interpreter, will need to explain to my client that the super fund will only pay out money when they are sure my client is really who they say they are. The interpreter and I will need to explain that unlike remote Indigenous people, city people do not know each other. Because of this, they use many different cards to prove to strangers, banks and government who they really are. It is both linguistically and conceptually challenging to convey and understand how this foreign mainstream Australian culture operates. Once the client has obtained some level of understanding, there are the complications of obtaining a birth certificate. Many elderly Indigenous people born in the APY lands had their birth records sent to and registered in Alice Springs, which used to act as an administrative centre for Central Australian Indigenous communities until the 1960s. Now Alice Springs no longer performs this function, so their births, deaths and marriages office cannot release a birth certificate for someone born in South Australia. An official request for a birth record transfer to Adelaide needs to be made. To achieve this, clinical records from Alice Springs Hospital need to be requested from the archives in person by the client or an authorised person. For the client, this may entail a 450-kilometre journey and a $300 bus fare. Once the archived records are obtained, an application to transfer and register the birth and accompanying clinical notes needs to be completed and sent down to Adelaide. Last time I did this, the whole process took 3 months. Once the record has been transferred, a birth certificate can be purchased. To purchase the birth certificate, my client will need to upgrade their bank card to a debit, Visa or MasterCard. The new card will take at minimum 2 weeks before it is sent out on the mail plane to the community. Upon receipt of the card, the birth certificate application is completed. The application will then be put in the post with a request to the relevant authority to withdraw money from the account only on pension day to ensure money is available. This needs to be explained to the client with an interpreter and family present, but is not always remembered. Applications cannot always be processed on the exact day, and processing may therefore need to wait for the next pension day to catch funds in the account. Last time I did this, it took 6 weeks before payment was processed. Once payment has been successfully made, the birth certificate will take 2 weeks to arrive in community on the weekly mail plane. Assuming the client receives the certificate in the minimum time, they then need to bring it to our office, make a photocopy and catch the police to certify it correctly. We often have new police rotating through the community who do not certify documents correctly. If this happens, it means we will need to return to the police station with our client to ensure all is done absolutely correctly. I recently had certified ID rejected by a super fund as the officer wrote, "This is a true and certified copy," instead of the required words, "This is a true and correct copy." Following certification of the birth certificate, I need to ensure the address on the ID confirming my client's residential address matches the address the super fund has on record. Postal and residential addresses are not prominent in the everyday interactions of many remote residents. My community does not have street names or individual letterboxes for home mail delivery. All mail comes to the community office and is picked up by residents. This means addresses are not often remembered. When documents from banks, tax, super funds or driver's licences appear with different variations of addresses, people tend not to notice. I'll then need to call the super fund and ask that they update their records to match the requisite ID for the client. We then post the certified copies and application for payment out to the super fund, which will take at least a week to arrive. This can be a lengthy process, taking around 6 months. This estimate doesn't include time my client may be required to attend cultural business far from the community, which can further elongate the process. At the end of the above phone call, the super fund employee recommended I write a letter to the Board of Trustees, outlining the situation and requesting a special review of my client's case. This process is heavily supported by MoneyMob staff and interpreters at every step, who spend many hours working on this single payment action. Without MoneyMob Talkabout, my client would never have been aware of or be able to access their money. In my experience, the manner of engagement and ID process of many super funds is inaccessible for the majority of remote Indigenous people in the APY lands. In 20 months supporting clients in the community, I do not know of a single person who would be confident to get on the phone to a super fund without initial support. The second story I think I'm going to have to skip over because of time, but story 3 is a short one which I can personally relate, having recently tried to assist an older client in Mimili community. It was unclear to me whether this client was asking us for help with superannuation, taxation or stolen wages. Many remote Aboriginal people find it difficult to understand and identify the component parts of Australia's financial systems, the rationale for them and the distinctions between them. However, they are often acutely aware, and correctly so, that they are due an entitlement. The client was understandably agitated at our difficulty in understanding him and disentangling the issue. In trying to clarify what the client needed, I embarked on a short history of superannuation. I was trying to ascertain whether the client had worked after the introduction of compulsory super in 1992, a detail about which they were unsure because dates and times are an alien way of measuring time for many remote people. I explained that most people in Australia didn't have super until 1992, even if they'd worked for many years. This was not particular to Aboriginal people, but also included people like my mother and father. The client looked at me in shock and told me I had to fix the situation. Sadly, I had to reply that it was not within my power to remedy. Our latest thinking is that this client may be searching for super owed for top-up hours worked in a community development employment program, although we're still not sure. Due to the changes in government policy and employment service providers over the years, we're not even sure where records to substantiate the client's claim would be held. To find out more, we will have to collect as much information from the client and others in a similar position as we can. Given the client's difficulty in identifying time periods, this will be challenging, to say the least. I've got 59 seconds. In the last 12 months, MoneyMob Talkabout has assisted clients on 288 occasions with a variety of super matters. Clients have ranged in age from 24 to 75. A significant number of contacts have involved education about super, what it is for, how to access it or find it if it is lost. Helping clients to access the superannuation of deceased relatives has also featured prominently in our work. However, we've also assisted with consolidations, increasing insurance cover, understanding and completing forms, updating personal details, calculating likely retirement payouts and setting up internet access to super accounts. We know that Aboriginal people want accessible, clear help to engage with and learn about financial institutions and processes. The data we glean from our client engagement every day demonstrates this. It's imperative that we all grasp the dimensions of the financial literacy learning curve, especially for remote people, and take steps to meet them halfway. Ask yourself if you would know how to say welcome in the Aranda language. Would you know how to introduce yourself or inquire after someone's health in Pitjantjatjara? Did you know where AMATA or ERNABELLA were before today? These points are not made to be smug, but rather to demonstrate that Aboriginal Australians are equally in need of literacy and competence. That non-Aboriginal Australians are equally in need of literacy and competence in their knowledge of Aboriginal people and cultures. Literacy is a two-way street. Genuine mutual interest in Aboriginal people by financial institutions is a good starting point for improving inclusivity and accessibility. Whilst industry continues to contemplate the systemic changes needed to enhance outcomes for Aboriginal people in relation to super, I encourage you to develop stronger links with the people and community themselves. Find out how many Aboriginal clients you have. Where do they live? What do they want and need? It was pleasing to note that as at June this year, a few funds already have specific initiatives targeted at their Indigenous members. Another suggestion is to leverage the work being done by intermediary services. Ask if you can join a money management or financial counselling service on a visit to a remote community sometime to share information with residents about super. Think about whether our knowledge and connections can add any value to your endeavours and vice versa.